Delighted you made it your decision to be here, and I encourage you to get your Bible, be turning to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where we were in our Bible class. And today we'll bring to a conclusion a series of studies we've been doing on questions that are found in the Bible. And we have talked each time about how questions are asked for different purposes. Sometimes a question is raised in a context and an answer is given. Sometimes a question is just left hanging because of the emphasis of the question makes the point that needs to be made. Jesus at times would answer a question with another question, and we found that a number of times. And so we began the series by talking about questions that Jesus asked, and we looked at a series of 16 questions that Jesus asked, which were probing and very practical in their nature. We followed that with a series of questions, 16 in number, that Jesus answered, where people asked Jesus a number of questions, and he answered them maybe with a question, sometimes with a point, sometimes disappointing to the people who asked. They were looking for more, and he would give them something contrary to what they were looking for. We followed that with looking at questions found in the book of Acts. We looked at a series of 9 questions in the book of Acts. And then last week we began by looking at questions in the epistles. And so we looked at 9 questions in the epistles, starting with Romans, and then we went into 1 Corinthians, and we want to continue that, and we jump now to 2 Corinthians. So let's talk about questions in the epistles. And let's start right here in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We're going to look at a series of 9 questions and bring this study to a close. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6. This was in our Bible class this morning, so this ought to be familiar to us. What part has a believer with an unbeliever? That was a question Paul asked. We developed the context. We didn't spend a lot of time in Bible class on that particular question. But the question is, what part has a believer with an unbeliever? Now let's put it back in the context. If you weren't in Bible class, let's understand what the context deals with. Paul is dealing here in chapter 6 with the demands of the ministry. Beginning at verse 14 of that context, he's talking about living separate and distinct lives, how the Christian is to live a separate life from the people of the world. Don't live like the rest of the world. Don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, he said at verse 14. And verse 14 to 16, where our question is asked, he's making the point, don't have fellowship with the world. In other words, don't participate with the world and don't do the same thing the world is doing. When you do that, you're having fellowship with them. Now, the reason for that was given at verse 16b and also verse 18, because you are the sons of God. You're the children of God. So because you are a child of God, you're trying to serve God, you're in the ministry of God, don't live like the rest of the world. He said at verse 17, come out from them and be separate from the world. Now let's focus on our question at verse 15. Verse 15, the question was, at the end of verse 15, what part has a believer with an unbeliever? Or another way of wording that, what part does a Christian have with a non-Christian? What part does a believer have with an unbeliever? There are actually 5 questions that are asked in 14 to 16. Let's go back and pick up the 5 questions. They're all asking the same thing. So let's start at verse 14. He said, what fellowship, I'm reading at the beginning, middle of verse 14, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? That's question 1. In other words, there's not agreement. You take the matter of righteousness on the one side, following after the principles of righteousness, following God's law, and lawlessness, a rejection of God's law, they don't agree. And what communion, idea of fellowship, has light with darkness? Light and darkness don't agree. All right, here's the next question. At verse 15, and what accord has Christ with Belial, or Satan? In other words, Christ and Satan are just the opposite. They don't agree with one another. Now then our question at verse 15, what accord or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? Now the next question at verse 16, number 5 is, what agreement has the temple of God with idols? He's dealing with opposite things. And he's dealing with the idea of, in the context of fellowship and association and participating in the same thing. So now I know, in light of those 5 questions, what the question is. I understand from the context what part has a believer with an unbeliever. Now, what is his point that he's making? What's the answer to that? And the answer is, implied by the question, they have none. There is no agreement between Satan and God. There is no agreement between light and darkness. There is no agreement between the believer and an unbeliever. So the answer is none, implied by the questions or the series of questions. In fact, verse 17 said, since there's not agreement, then you need to separate from the world. Now let's make some application of that as we were doing in Bible class this morning. What I'm learning from that is the Christian should be distinct from the world. In other words, the way that you live needs to look different from the world. When the way that you live and the way that you talk and the way that you behave and the way that you dress and the way that you act and the things you go to and the things you participate in is not any different from the world, then we're having fellowship with the world. We're doing the same thing. We have joint participation with the world. The Christian is to be distinct from the world. Verse 1 of chapter 7, as we noted in Bible class, we're to put away all forms of worldliness. Cleanse yourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit. Not just purity of thought, but purity of action. Not just purity of action, but also purity of words. In other words, be pure in all areas, in all forms of life. The Christian has nothing in common with those who practice a life of sin. So join with them. That doesn't mean you have to literally be with them, but when you participate in sin, you've joined hands with them and pulling in that same load of sin. Let's go to another question. This time we go to the book of Galatians, chapter 4 and in verse 9, and another question found in chapter 5 and in verse 7. Here are the 2 questions. Same thing basically, but the question is, how is it that you turn again? In other words, how is it that you're turning back? And the second question was, who hindered you? In other words, who caused this? Those are good questions, aren't they? So let's go to Galatians chapter 4 and look at the context now and see exactly what is being asked in the context. Now, the book of Galatians defends, like 2 Corinthians does, it defends Paul's apostleship and his doctrine of justification by faith apart from the law. It was that doctrine, by the way, that caused the Judaizing teachers to be critical of him, both in 2 Corinthians, Romans, and in Galatians. So Paul is defending his apostleship here in this book. He's defending his doctrine of justification by faith apart from the law. There was the threat of Jewish teachers. In fact, let's go back to chapter 1. Some had already turned back. That's important to make our point from chapter 5 in a moment. He said, I marvel, verse 6, that you are turning away so soon from him that called you into the grace into a different gospel. Here Paul had gone to Galatians, among the Galatians. He had taught the gospel. They had responded. And he said, I am amazed that so soon you're turning back to the things that you left. You left Judaism and you're going back to Judaism. I don't understand. I marvel that you're going back so soon. Now in chapters 3 through 4, that is chapter 3 and chapter 4, those 2 chapters focus on justification by faith apart from the law. You want a good dose of what it means to be justified by faith, separate and apart from the law? Read those 2 chapters and you've got the point. That's what he does in those 2 chapters. Now notice at chapter 4, beginning at verse 8 now, his point is this. Since you are free from sin, why do you go back into bondage? That is, you came out of Judaism, you came out of sin, you've been delivered from sin. Why do you want to go back into bondage? That's the point of the context. Now let's go to our questions in chapter 4 and in verse 9. In that context, here is his question. At verse 9, chapter 4, verse 9, but now after you've known God, or rather known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? There's his question. You see, that's in this context of talking about you're free from sin. Why go back to the bondage of the law? So my question is, Paul is saying in chapter 4 and verse 9, I want to know, why after you came to know God, or God knows you, and you have a relationship with God, why do you want to go back and lose that relationship? Now, chapter 5 and verse 7, before we look at the point, here's the second question. He said you ran well. I like the wording of the King James. You did run well. You were running well. You were doing quite well in your Christian race. Now verse 7, he said, who hindered you from obeying the truth. Some of you are wanting to turn back again, and I want to know who caused that. What contributed to that? Who helped you go in that direction? Now, let's see the point that's being made. His point, or the answer to the question, here's the point of chapter 4 and verse 9. Why go back to bondage when you have been freed? In other words, you've been delivered from the bondage. Why do you want to go back into bondage? That's his point. In chapter 5, verse 7, the point there is focusing on the influence of the false teachers that led you astray. Now, you've gone back. There was something that contributed to that. Who did that? Who encouraged that? Where did you get the idea that you ought to go back? Somebody encouraged that. That's the point that he's making in chapter 5 and in verse 7. Let's make some application for us. It's very practical, hopefully. And the question ought to be to us, why would one who is free from sin go back to the bondage again? You say, I'm not under the influence of Judaizing teachers. That's not the application I'm making. That is, that applies to each and every one of us. Once I've been free from sin, I became a child of God. I've been forgiven of my sin. I'm free from the bondage of sin. Why would I want to go back into a life of sin and continue in that? Why do I want to go back where I came from? Why would I want to go back into bondage? Once I'm on the road to heaven, why do I want to get back on the road to hell? You see, when you obeyed the gospel, you understood I'm on the road to hell and I'm going to lose my soul. I want to get on the road to heaven. And once you're on that road, why do you want to go back on this road over here? That's the question that he's asking. You were doing well. The question is, let's go to chapter 5 and verse 7. You did run well. Things were going in the right direction. You were growing and you were developing and you were becoming stronger and stronger each day. Now the question is, who hindered you? Who hindered you from obeying the truth? Was it family that did that? In some cases it was. Is it family that hindered you? Why aren't you doing better? You were running well and you've turned back. Why is that? Was it family that did that? Is it the wrong crowd? Is it the friend that persuaded you to go back and says it's more fun over here? Is it the friend that encouraged you to participate? Is it the friend that ridiculed you for your high standards that caused you to go back? Who hindered you so that you did not obey the truth? What caused you to leave the principles you once knew? Is it a modernist book you've been reading? For some, they read from a modernist. A modernist is one who denies the inspiration of the Scriptures. Denies really that God is involved in the Scriptures. Is that modernist book, or was it that modernist professor you've been listening to? Was it that modernist teacher on the YouTube channel? Is that what caused you to turn back? You were doing well. Who hindered you so that you did not obey the truth? What was that? It's a good question, isn't it? What led you astray? What caused you to go in the opposite direction? Let's look at a third question. Let's go to the book of Hebrews this time. In the Hebrew letter, chapter 12 and verse 7, the question is, what son does a father not chasten? What son is there that a father does not chasten? Let's put that in its context. What is that about? What son is there that a father does not chasten? Well, here's what chapter 12 of the book of Hebrews is about. It is encouraging us to have the same kind of faith and the same kind of endurance as the heroes that we read about in chapter 11. You see, chapter 11 we call Faith's Hall of Fame. Here are great heroes of faith, people who had great faith, and here's what faith did for them. So what's chapter 12 about? Encouraging us to be just like them, to have the same kind of faith, the same kind of endurance like they had. Don't give up. Keep pressing on. Now, notice at chapter 12, verses 4 through 11, beginning at verse 4, that he said, you have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. He is telling them to endure affliction and persecution very patiently. Oh, yes, you're under severe persecution. That's part of the theme of the book of Hebrews. That's part of the point of the book of Hebrews. Encouraging them not to let the pressure of persecution get them. So have the same kind of faith that they had, chapter 11. Endure your afflictions, endure your persecutions, You have not yet resisted unto blood. Now the text calls this persecution a chastening of the Lord. Look at verse 5. He said, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. That's in the context of talking about persecution. Verse 4. But he calls it a chastening of the Lord. Look at verse 7. Verse 7 said, if you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. Calls it a chastening of the Lord. Look at verse 8. But if you are without chastening, you're become partakers with them who are illegitimate and not sons. All right, 3 times in the context of talking about persecution, he calls it a chastening, a discipline of the Lord. Now here's his question at verse 7. In that context, now I know why he asked. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom the Father does not chasten? In other words, if you're a child of God, you're going to suffer persecution. In fact, he tells us all children of God are going to suffer persecution. At verse 6 and in verse 7, God scourges every son he receives. So if you are enduring persecution, it's because you're a child of God. And by the way, what son does the Father not chasten? Now let's see what the point is in the context. The point is, he's making a parallel to the chastening of a son to that of persecution. Let's go to verse 9, 10, and 11. The point about chastening, that is, disciplining of a child, here's a father disciplines a child, that makes the child better. It's very unpleasant. Look at verse 9. Furthermore, we had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. In other words, they disciplined, they chastened us. Shall we much not more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? There's your parallel. For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who are trained by it. You see, chastening trains and molds the child. Here's his point. His point in the context is, your suffering you're going through is like the chastening of a son, the discipline of a child. Well, it's not pleasant, but it makes him better. So likewise, he's saying, the suffering you're going through is going to make you better, and thus it's called the chastening of the Lord. Now, at verse 7 and 8, here's his point in our question. If you don't suffer hardships, then you're not a son. Now, notice at verse 6, he scourges every son he receives. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to suffer the same degree of suffering and persecution and hardship that everyone else does. But if you are a faithful child of God, at some point in your life, there is going to be a hardship because of your faith. Now, his point is, if you're a child of God, you're going to suffer hardship. And if you don't suffer hardship, then you're not a child of God. That's the point he's making. Now, every child of God is chastened in some way. Now, let's make some application of that. What son does a father not chasten? Well, I'm learning something from that about, in the context, because of the parallel, that children should be chastened and corrected for their good. You say, well, this context really isn't addressing the family relationship and giving instructions how to raise children. No, it's not, but it is there by implication because of the parallel. So I walk away from the text learning children should be disciplined and corrected for their good. Here's the second thing I'll learn. We should not be shocked and surprised or amazed when we suffer for our stand for truth. In other words, you decide to become a Christian and you become faithful and dedicated and you stand firmly for the truth. And it may be some family member that turns against you. It may be co-workers that turn against you. You may feel the world in general has turned against you. It may even be some brethren that turn on you and you suffer and you somehow are standing for the truth and you are suffering because of it. Don't be shocked and surprised. What son does the Father not chasten? You're a child of God, aren't you? And children are to be chastened, and this is part of the chastening or training we go through. Don't be surprised at that. Here's another thing I learned from this context. Don't let affliction and suffering and ridicule keep you from serving the Lord. It's ultimately for your good. So when I take my stand for truth and I suffer somehow, don't back away and say, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. But just understand that's God's using that. God's not causing it, but He's using that to make me a better person. He'll make me a better person through this. Let's go to another question. Question number 4. Can faith save him? James 2:14. Can faith save him? Now, if you take that out of context and you were just to throw that question out, can faith save him? You may say, well, yeah, faith can save him. Well, is the answer to that question yes? It might be the answer no. Let's see. We got to know the context. What's he talking about in the context? Well, let's go to the context of James chapter 2. Here's the context. James 2 is talking about faith and works. That is important. James 2 is talking about faith and works and how they go together. James 2 is not talking about and assuming an obedient faith all the way through. What James 2 is addressing is the connection between faith and works or obedience. That's what he's doing in the context. Now, what he says is that faith without works is dead, beginning at verse 14. We're going to come back to 14. Let's run forward and get to the end at verse 26. Let's fast forward to the conclusion. As the body without the spirit is dead, so then faith without works is dead also. All right, there's the point in verses 14 to 26. What's the point? The point is faith, if it doesn't have works, is dead. Now then, here's our question in that context. The question is, can faith save him? Your English Standard, American Standard says, can that faith save him? That's the point, whether your translation has that or not, because what he just said, look at verse 14. What does it profit a man if one says he has faith but he doesn't have works? Here's a man who says he has faith, but there's nothing to show that faith. There is no action, there is no works, there is no obedience. Can faith save him? Can that kind of faith that I just mentioned save him? So the American Standard, English Standard, renders that correctly. Can that faith save? Can that kind of faith save him? Now, there are 3 more questions in the context. Let's get those. Similar. Let's look at verse 16. And one says, depart from me in peace, be warmed and filled. You do not give him the things that he needs for the body. What does it profit? Same question, but what he's saying is, you say to someone who is in need, you say, well, go be warmed and filled, but you don't do anything. There's no action to your words. What good did that do? Look at verse 20, another question. Do you want to know, O foolish man, that faith without works is dead? Do you know that faith without works is dead? That's his question. Look at verse 22. Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and that by works faith was made perfect? In other words, do you understand from looking at the example given that faith plus works is complete, is useful, and is practical? Now let's see what the point of all these questions are. Can that faith save him? Faith without obedience will not save. That's his point. That's the whole point in the context. Faith without action will not save. Faith without obedience won't do any good, and faith without obedience is dead. What he's saying is you can't have faith on the one side and say, I believe, but then on the other hand, you're not doing anything about that. Faith without works is dead. Let's make some application of that. What do I learn? What do I take home with me? I'm learning that our faith is meaningless if it doesn't act. If I have faith, and I believe, and I accept, and I read, and I understand, but it doesn't act, my faith is meaningless. I'm learning that my faith is demonstrated not by what we say, but what we do. What do we mean by that? Quite often we hear someone say, you know what, I love the Lord. I really love the Lord. I haven't given up on my love for the Lord. Or maybe they go through some trying times and they'll say something like, my faith has kept me going. My faith has kept me strong. But all through that, they're not doing anything to be obedient to the Lord. Can that faith save? And the answer is no. Our faith is not demonstrated by what we say. It is demonstrated by what we do. We need to understand that many believers will be lost. Many will say, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name? And in thy name cast out demons. And he'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Luke 6:46. Many believers will be lost. Same book, next chapter. Let's go to chapter 3, verse 11. Here's an interesting question. And the question is, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Have you ever been asked that question? You know the text, but has anyone ever come up to you and said, does a spring bring forth sweet water and bitter from the same spot? What is he talking about in the context? Well, James chapter 3 talks about controlling the tongue. That's the whole point of the chapter. He's talking about the tongue and controlling the tongue. Look at verse 6. Verse 6 compares the tongue as like a spark of fire. The point in the illustration is just like a spark of fire. You don't play with matches on your living room floor if you've got carpet because you think, you know what, that spark, it's a little fire, but it could kindle and burn the whole place down. The tongue is pictured like that. It can be dangerous. All right? Verse 8 says, the tongue can no man tame. What he means by that, it's extremely hard to keep it under control. Very hard. No one has mastered it, in fact. No one can say, you know what, I've mastered that. I've got my tongue under complete control. It will never get out of hand. It will never say something it shouldn't. No one does that. All right, here's another point. Verse 19, same context. Be swift to hear, slow to speak. Control your tongue. Verse 26 says, if any man seems to be religious and doesn't bridle his tongue, his religion is vain. I'm learning that control of the tongue is a basic part of religion. It's not that I have my religion over here, my relationship to God, and I have trouble with my tongue. That's a different matter. That's a part of your religion. That's part of your relationship to God. So therefore, control the tongue. Now look at verses 9 and 10 in that context. Man tries to use his tongue to do contrary things. He said, we bless God and our Father, and with it we curse men who are made in the similitude of God. And out of the same mouth proceeds both blessing and cursing, and these things ought not so to be. He said, here's what we do sometimes. We take our tongue and we try to praise God on the one hand, and then we turn around and we curse men with that same tongue. Now then, the question at verse 11. His question is, does a spring bring forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? In fact, in these two verses, there are three questions. That was one. Look at verse 11. Verse 12. Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives? Or a grapevine bear figs? In other words, can you go to a grapevine and get figs off of that? And grapes at the same time? No, you can't. Now, let's see the point that he's making. His point here is that a spring and trees do not produce different fruits. You don't have a spring, and it may have bitter water, and that's what it's going to have. It doesn't also produce sweet water. You don't have an apple tree, and it also has some, at the next limb next to it, have some oranges on the same tree. You just don't have that. So trees and spring do not produce different fruits. What I'm learning from that, and here's the point, you can't use the tongue to do good and evil at the same time. I say, well, I like to praise God on Sunday, but I do some other things with my tongue. No, that's his point. Now let's make some application, very practical, hopefully to us. And here's this, that we can't praise God on Sunday and then curse on Monday. You see, that's hypocritical to say, you know what, I come and I sing how I love thee, O God. But then Monday I'm cursing and using foul language on Monday. You can't do that. You're trying to use the same mouth to produce two different fruits. That's like saying I'm going to plant one tree and I'm going to have apples and oranges on the same tree. Let's just see if that works. You see, you can't honor God on Sunday, then slander your brethren through the week. You can't come and honor God on the Lord's Day and then stab your brethren in the back in your language throughout the week. You can't sing praises to God on Wednesday and tell dirty jokes over the weekend. You can't do that. You can't grow apples and oranges on the same tree. It just doesn't work. Good question. Let's go to the next question. Question number 6, chapter 4. Next chapter. We've looked at 2, 3, now 4. Where do wars and fighting come from? Where do wars and fights or fighting come from among you? What's the context? Well, the context deals in chapter 4 with friendship with the world. It talks about being friends of the world in this context. Notice at verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity against God? The whole context deals with friendship with the world. Now, what the chapter does is specifies what friendship with the world involves. Now, I'm not going to put that on the screen before you, but follow with me, for example, at verse 2. The neglect of prayer would be one of those. You neglect prayer, that's part of being a friendship of the world. Verse 4, spiritual adultery would be one of those. Verse 5, envy would be one of those. Pride, verse 6. Judging your brother, verse 11. Being overconfident concerning your future, verses 13 to 16. Failing, verse 17, to do what you know you should be doing. And now let's go back to verse 1 and add one more. Wars and fighting. That's part of friendship with the world. So here's the question, chapter 4, verse 1. So where do war and fights come from among you? It's in that context, being a friend of the world. Like all these other sins that are listed, there's wars and fightings among you. Where's it come from? Well, let's see what his answer and his point is. His point is that wars and fightings don't come from God. In other words, notice that the phrase among you suggests that here is some wars and fightings going on among brethren. Here's some bickering going on between brethren who are not fighting for the cause of truth, but there's wars and fighting going on and bickering and the kind of division like you saw at Corinth. And he said, where did that come from? The implication is it didn't come from God. Somebody's not following the Lord. His point, verse 1, it comes from your own desires and your own pleasures. Let's read the rest of verse 1. He said, do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war against our members, your members? He answered the question. Where do they come from? I'll tell you where they come from. They come from your own desire and your own pleasure. You see, bickering and fighting and friction come about because of selfish focus. Isn't that true in a family? Here's bickering going on in the family. Somebody is selfish. That's why they're bickering and fighting and fussing all the time, while they yell at one another. And so there's two brothers or two sisters at odds, and there's bickering and fighting and fussing and friction. It's going on because of somebody has a selfish focus. Let's make some application of that. Here's what I'm learning from that. I'm learning from that there's no justifiable reason for Christians to have harsh clashes. In other words, here's a Christian and here's a Christian, and they're just clashing and they can't get along. They can't even speak to one another. There's no justifiable reason for that. I didn't say there wasn't a reason. He gave us one at verse 1. But there's no justifiable reason for that. Secondly, I'm learning that when we have fights, bitter fights, we're friends of the world. In other words, I come to church and I claim I'm a friend of God. But when I'm bickering and fighting, I'm actually telling everybody I'm a friend of the world. That's where I am. That's where my allegiance is with the world. Question number 7. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 4. What will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? What will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? Let's put that in its context. The book of 1 Peter is about living holy in all of our conduct. Be holy for as he is holy. Chapter 1, 15 and 16 sets the pace for not only chapter 1, but all the chapters that follow. Now, in the context of living holy as God is holy, chapter 4 talks about how living holy includes living pure and enduring suffering. Enduring suffering. Now, what does he say about suffering? Well, he talks about suffering as a Christian. If any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, verse 16, but let him glorify God on this behalf. Now, beginning at verse 17 of 1 Peter chapter 4, we endure suffering in view of a judgment that is to come. So why do I need to go through this? I'm a Christian and I'm suffering, and I know I'm wanting to live pure, and Peter, you're telling me that in order to live pure, I've got to endure through this suffering, but this isn't very fun. Well, you go ahead and endure that in view of the fact there is a judgment coming. Notice starting at verse 17. When the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God, and if it begins there first, what will be the end of those who obey not the gospel? Let's jump down to verse 19. Therefore let those who suffer according to his will commit their souls to him in doing good as to a faithful Creator. You submit to that suffering and endure through that because there is a judgment to come. Now here's the question at verse 17. Judgment is going to begin at the house of God, and if it begins there, what will be the end of those who do not obey the gospel? Now I know the context. I want to know what the point is. What's the point of that? Now let's get the point. Judgment is beginning at the house of God. That probably refers to the destruction upon the Jewish nation, Jerusalem particularly, in AD 70. And you say, I don't think so. Okay, then go that direction. I won't argue with you. But I think it probably is talking about judgment beginning at the house of God. In other words, God's bringing judgment on his own people, his nation. These are his chosen people. And he's about to bring a heavy hand of judgment like has never been before or will ever be again upon the nation of the Jews. And if judgment begins there, then what's going to happen to those who never even obeyed the gospel? And so consequently, don't give up in the midst of that suffering. Suffer as a Christian. Now, that applies in principle now. You say, we're not facing the destruction of Jerusalem. No, but if judgment begins at the house of God, what's going to happen to those that don't obey the gospel? You see, if God judges his people, what will he do with those who don't even obey? Never even became Christians to start with. Never even were identified as his people. That's the point he's making. Now let's make some application. What I'm learning from this context is if God judges his own people, then he certainly will judge the world. In other words, here's somebody that's not even claiming to be a person of God, and is God going to bring judgment on them? Well, you bet he's going to, because he judges his own people. Evidence, he destroyed Jerusalem, didn't he? And if God judges the Jewish nation, he'll judge unfaithful Christians. When his own people became unfaithful, he condemned them. He'll condemn us as well. And if God didn't even spare Jerusalem, he's not going to spare any who are living in sin. She said, I don't think God will overlook my case. You think he will? He didn't even spare Jerusalem. His own city he didn't spare. What makes you think he'll spare you? Powerful question. Those that don't obey the gospel are going to be ultimately lost. I'll learn that from this context. Question number 8. Let's go to 1 John chapter 4 and verse 20. Very practical question. If you hate your brother whom you have seen, how can you love God whom you've not seen? If you hate your brother whom you've seen, how can you love God whom you have not seen? One of the two major points in the book of 1 John is that God is love. The first major point is God is light. That's established in chapter 1. But one of the two major points is found in chapter 4, and that is God is love. Look at chapter 4, verse 8. He that does not love does not know God, for God is love. Verse 16, and we have known and believed the love that God has for us. God is love. Twice he drove home the point, God is love. That's one of the two major points of the book. Now, in light of that, the theme of loving our brethren is found in 3 chapters in 1 John. It's not a big book. But you go to chapter 2 and he talks about loving your brethren. You go to chapter 3, he talks about loving the brethren. And then go to chapter 4, it talks about loving your brothers. It's a major theme. Loving one another. Now, here's the question at verse 20. In light of that context, we ought to love our brethren. Now look at 1 John chapter 4 and verse 20. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, how can he love God, whom he has not seen? Let's get the point. What's the point being made here? The point is you can't love God and not love the brethren. That's point verses 20 and 21. In fact, he says at verse 20, if you make the claim that you love God while you hate your brother, you're a liar. Because you don't love God. Oh, I love my God. Now, don't get me wrong. I love my God. I just don't love my brethren. By the way, hate in the context, 1 John 3:15 defines that per context, is a lack of love, not hatred in the sense of despisal. So if you say, well, I love God, but I really don't love my brethren like I ought to. I don't despise, but I just don't love them like I ought to. You're a liar, he says. Well, let's make some application of that. Here's what I learned from that. You can't claim to love God if you don't love your brethren. And I'm learning that if you're having a hard time loving some brother with whom you see and you interact, and you can see him, you can visually see him, then you're having trouble loving God whom you can't see. So I love God. I really love God. Really? When you can see this brother and you can interact with a brother and you still don't love them and you're having struggles there, how can you be loving God? And what I'm learning from this is that our love for one another is directly tied to our love for God. By that I simply mean that you can't love God without loving your brother. It's directly tied one to the other. One more question and we're done. Chapter 5 of 1 John, next chapter over, who overcomes the world? Who overcomes the world? Chapter 5, verses 4 and 5. Let's get the context, then we'll come to the question. Chapter 5 seems to shift gears slightly from chapters 2, 3, and 4. And he talks about faith in chapter 5. In fact, the whole chapter is about faith. He talks about a number of things. That faith is the basis for the love that he had talked about earlier. He talks beginning at verse 6 about the evidence for the faith. But I want you to focus on verses 4 and 5. His point is that faith is the victory. For whoever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith, he said. Now here's the question. Verse 5. Who is he that overcomes the world but he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? Now we're still talking about context. That directly ties to verse 3. Verse 3 had just made the point that his commandments are not burdensome. In other words, the commands of God, what God expects me to do, are not so burdensome that the weight is getting so heavy, I just can't carry the load, I have to just drop it. I can't carry that load. It's too much for me. No, the commandments of God are not burdensome. I can carry that load. Now, here's the point. Here's the point. It's directly connected to the fact that they're not burdensome, and we're going to make a point from that. Here's the point I want you to see. That those that are given to the world and dedicated to worldly lives may say the demands of God are too great, too much for us to bear. You see, your God is expecting too much out of me, and I'm not going to become a servant of your God. I can't do all the things you say I got to do, to give up all these practices and live faithfully and keep all these commands. That's just too burdensome for me. I can't do that. And so I can't overcome the world. But the child of God has a different point of view. And he says, I can overcome. I can do that. It is not that burdensome. Verse 4, verse 5 directly ties to verse 3. Now, what's the point being made here? That one who has faith is victorious. Who is he that overcomes the world? It's the one who believes in Christ. What's the point? The point is, this is focusing on the confidence in Jesus as the one who makes that victory happen. It is not saying if you have some kind of acknowledgement there is a God, you're going to overcome and you can do all things because you have some kind of faith. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is that the one who is victorious and overcomes the world, he's focusing on the fact that through Jesus I have the strength to overcome. That's his point. I can overcome sin, I can overcome temptation, the pressures and the influence of the world through Christ if I have faith. I'm confident that I have faith in the one who can help me through that. That's his point. Let's make some application of that. What I'm learning from that is we can overcome the world and its influence. And so you look around and the world has a lot of pressure coming. Maybe it's from friends, maybe it's from work, maybe it's from school. Maybe it's other influences that are coming in, and the world has a great deal of pressure. I can overcome the world and its influence. A life that pleases God, a pure life, is not impossible. And anyone who pictures it as a burden that's too great to carry, I can't do that, you're going to have to drop that weight because I can't carry that load. They missed the boat. Not so. We only overcome if we maintain a strong faith. That's the point. So what have we seen in this final lesson on questions? We've looked at 9 questions found in the epistles, starting 2 Corinthians, going through 1 John. There are more questions, but these are a sampling. What part has a believer with an unbeliever? How is it that you turn again, and who hindered you? What son does a father not chasten? Can that faith save him? Does a spring bring forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? And where do wars and fights come from? And what will be the end of those that obey not the gospel? And if you hate your brother whom you've seen, how can you love God whom you've not seen? And who is he that overcomes the world? That's just a sampling of the questions that we find there. That doesn't even mention questions that are found in the Old Testament. The questions Moses would ask, or Joshua would ask, or the prophets would ask. There's a world of questions found in the Bible. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?